I want to start with the priest. Not because the priest is the villain of this story. He is not the villain. I have thought about this carefully over the past 2 years, and I have arrived at the conclusion that Father Romereo is a man who did what he understood his responsibility to require, who applied the framework he had been given to a situation the framework was not designed for, and who reached a conclusion that was wrong in the specific way that correct frameworks applied to incorrect assumptions produce wrong conclusions. He is not a villain. He is a man who looked at a 63-year-old American and a 23-year-old Filipino woman and saw a category rather than two people. I understand the category. I want to say that up front, because I am not going to pretend I don't know what it looks like from the outside. I know what it looks like from the outside. I knew what it looked like from the outside before I was inside it, when I was still a man in Seattle who consumed the same cultural assumptions as everyone else, and who would have, if you had described my situation to me at 50, raised the same eyebrow that Father Romereo raised at 63. The eyebrow is not unreasonable. The eyebrow is what happens when a person has seen enough of a category to have formed a pattern and applies the pattern to the next thing that resembles it. The problem is that people are not categories. They are people. And when a pattern meets a person, the pattern is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. And the only way to know which is to look at the actual person, which requires more than an eyebrow and less than a refusal. Father Romereo did not look at the actual people. He looked at the numbers. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the beginning, because the beginning is where everything that happened after lives. My name is Joe. I am 65 now, which means I was 63 when this story begins. And I want to give you the full version of the 63 years before it, so that when I tell you about Maravik, you understand who was falling in love with whom, and why the 40 years between us is not the story and never was. I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, the son of a commercial fisherman and a woman who taught 3rd grade, and who between them produced in me a person who was equally comfortable with physical work and with reading, which is a combination that turned out to be useful in a career as a civil engineer and somewhat less useful in 2 marriages that ended in the specific way that marriages end when one person is more comfortable with physical problems and their solutions than with emotional ones and their requirements. 36 years as a civil engineer for a firm in Seattle that specialized in infrastructure, roads and bridges, and the occasional dam, the work that makes everything else possible and that nobody notices until something goes wrong. I was good at it. I was the kind of good that compounds quietly over decades and produces a man who arrives at 60 with a reputation for reliability that is more valuable than talent and harder to build. I retired at 62 with a pension that was comfortable and a silence in my house that was not. My first marriage was to a woman named Patricia, who was good and organized and who left when I was 48 because the house was too quiet even when I was in it, which was an accurate description of me at 48, and for which I have nothing but understanding in retrospect. My second marriage was to a woman named Carol, who was warm and generous, and who died of cancer at 57, 4 years before I retired, and whose death produced in me a specific quality of alone that was different from the alone of the first divorce. The divorce alone was a clean severance. Carol's alone was the kind with irregular edges, the kind that snagged on things when you moved through the day, on the coffee cup that was still in the cabinet in the number she used to use, on the television remote in the place she always left it, on the silence that was the same silence as before, but was now also the silence where her voice used to be. I came to the Philippines at 62. The reasons were the reasons. A pension that stretched further in Dumaguete than in Seattle, a retirement that needed somewhere to be, and a specific quality of grief that required, I had decided, a change in the scenery against which it was being conducted. I landed in April, rented an apartment on a lane near the boulevard, and began the process of becoming a person who lived in the Philippines rather than a person who was visiting it. 8 months in, that is when I met Maravik. I want to tell you about meeting her in the honest way rather than the romantic way, because the honest way is more interesting and more true, and because the romantic version of this story has been written many times by many people, and most of those versions are not honest, and most of those stories do not end well, and this one does, and the reason it does is the honesty underneath it. I met her at the public market on a Saturday morning. She was arguing with a fish vendor. I want to be precise about the arguing, because arguing is not the right word, and I am going to try to find the right word. She was conducting a negotiation that had escalated beyond the vendor's expectations. She was 23 years old, which I did not know yet, and she was standing at a fish stall with a hand on her hip, and a voice that had started at conversational and moved to declarative, and was currently at a register that had produced in the vendor the expression of a man who has encountered a force he did not anticipate, and is reassessing the situation. She was arguing about the price of lapu-lapu, the grouper fish, which the vendor had quoted at a number she considered inconsistent with the posted price on the board behind him, and which she was making clear she would not be moving past until the inconsistency was resolved. It was resolved in her favor. She took her fish and turned, and I was standing approximately 1 meter behind her because I had been at the adjacent stall and had become aware of the negotiation, the way you become aware of things that have a specific quality of aliveness to them. And she looked at me with the directness of someone who has just won an argument and is still in the momentum of it, and said, in English, "He changes the price for foreigners. You should know." I said, "Thank you." She said, "What are you buying?" I said, "Tanig, the Spanish mackerel." She said, "Not from him, 2 stalls down, the one with the red cooler. The fish is fresher and he does not change the price." She walked away. I bought my Tanig from the stall with the red cooler. The fish was, as advertised, fresh. I saw her again the following Saturday at the same market. She was at the vegetable section this time, buying kangkong with the focused attention of someone who had opinions about kangkong, which in my 8 months of Saturday market attendance I had come to understand was something that most people in Dumaguete had, and that they acted on with a specificity I had initially found surprising and had come to find charming. She saw me. She said, "The Tanig, was it fresh?" I said it was. She said, "Good." She went back to the kangkong. I went to the fish stall with the red cooler. At some point in the next 20 minutes, we were both at the same papaya vendor, and she told me, without being asked which papaya was ripe and how to tell, pressing the skin with her thumb and explaining the resistance that indicated the correct stage of ripeness. And I learned more about papaya in 4 minutes than I had accumulated in 8 months of independent acquisition. I said, "Can I buy you a coffee?" She looked at me. The direct, assessing look that I would come to understand was her primary mode of encountering the world, looking at things as they actually were, rather than as they had been presented or as she had expected them. She looked at me for a moment, and she said, "Why?" I said, "Because you have been helpful 2 Saturdays in a row, and I would like to say thank you properly." She said, "Foreigners usually ask me to coffee because they want something else." I said, "I want coffee." She looked at me again. Then she said, "Okay. I know a place." The place she knew was a small coffee shop near the university that I had not found in 8 months of walking the same neighborhood, a testament to the specific invisibility of good small places that do not have signs designed to attract people who are not already looking for them. She ordered something local, Barako with condensed milk, and I ordered the same because she had just proven her judgment was better than mine about the relevant items, and I saw no reason not to extend the trust. We talked for 2 hours. I want to tell you what we talked about, because the what is the answer to the eyebrow that Father Romerio would raise later. She was 23. She had grown up in a barangay outside Dumaguete, the second of 5 children, the daughter of a fisherman, and a woman who ran a small sari-sari store that she had expanded from a window into a proper small shop over 20 years through the specific combination of shrewd management and absolute refusal to extend credit to people who had not demonstrated the capacity to repay it. She had graduated from Silliman University 6 months before with a degree in economics that she had funded partly through a scholarship and partly through the specific resourcefulness of a woman who has been watching her mother manage a business since she was old enough to observe what managing a business required. She was working at a small accounting firm near the boulevard. She was not satisfied with this. She said it with the plainness of someone who does not perform contentment she does not feel. She was not satisfied because the work was small and her capacity was larger, and the gap between them was the thing she was currently figuring out what to do about. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to run something. My own thing. I have not decided what yet, but I know the size of what I want to run, and the current thing is not that size." I said, "What size do you want?" She said, "Larger than I am being trusted with." I understood that, precisely and personally, and from the inside. I had been the person who was being trusted with less than his capacity for the first 8 years of my engineering career, and I remembered the specific frustration of it, and the specific feeling when the trust finally caught up with the capacity. I said so. She looked at me with the assessing look. She said, "You understand that?" I said, "I spent 8 years of my career being underestimated." She said, "What did you do about it?" I said, "I built things that were impossible to ignore." She said, "That is what I am going to do." We sat with our coffee. Then she said, "What did you build?" I said, "Roads, bridges, the infrastructure that makes other things possible." She said, "And here, what are you building here?" I said, "I don't know yet. I have been here 8 months trying to figure that out." She said, "That is an honest answer. Most people would say they are building a life. That is the usual answer." I said, "It is a good answer. It is just not yet accurate for me." She said, "I respect that you know the difference." That was the first conversation. I want you to hold it, because the first conversation is the evidence against the category that Father Romerio applied to us later. The first conversation was between a 62-year-old engineer who was trying to figure out what he was building and a 23-year-old economist who already knew what she wanted to build and was working out the path. The 40 years between us was a fact of arithmetic. It was not the fact of the conversation. We had coffee the following Saturday, and the one after that. I want to be honest about how it progressed, because the honest version is not the version of the older foreign man and the young local woman that the category describes. The version I am telling you is 2 people who had enough to say to each other that the Saturdays became necessary rather than optional, who found in each other a specific quality of attention that neither had expected and both had needed, and who arrived at the acknowledgement of what was happening between them slowly and then all at once, the way Hemingway said about going broke, which I had occasion to reference earlier in this story, and which is a sentence that applies to more than debt. I told her the arithmetic at month 3, not as a confession or a barrier or a limitation. As a fact, she deserved to have plainly stated. I said, "Maravik, I am 62 years old." She said, "I know." I said, "You are 23. She said, "I know that too." I said, "That is 39 years. She said, 40 in April. You have a birthday in April." I said, "Yes." She said, "I know the arithmetic, Joe. I studied economics. I can add." I said, "I need you to know that I know it too, and that I am not pretending it is not a real thing." She looked at me with the look. Then she said, "The arithmetic is a fact. It is not a verdict unless we make it one." She picked up her coffee. "Are you going to make it a verdict?" I said no. She said, "Then neither am I." We were together from that conversation forward. I want to tell you about Maravic's family, because the family is part of the story, in the way that Filipino families are always part of the story, which is to say centrally and without apology, and with the full weight of their love and their concern and their opinions, delivered in the specific combination that constitutes a Filipino family's engagement with a situation it considers important. Her father, Mang Ben, was 54, a fisherman with 40 years of the sea in his body and the specific stillness of men who spend their lives in the particular silence of the water before dawn. He looked at me the first time I came to the house with the look that fathers give men who are coming to see their daughters, and then he did the calculation, and the calculation produced an expression I could not fully read, and which I later understood was the expression of a man who is encountering something his framework was not built for, and who is deciding in real time what to build instead. He said, in Cebuano that Maravic translated, "You are older than me." I said yes. He said something else. Maravic translated, he says, "That is strange." He says, he needs to think about it. He thought about it for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, he did not say yes and did not say no, and did not express an opinion directly about anything related to me or my presence in his daughter's life. He went fishing every morning at 4 and came back at noon and cleaned his catch and ate lunch and sat in the chair outside his front door in the afternoon. On the 14th day, he called me over to the chair and pointed at the chair next to it, and I sat down, and he handed me a cup of coffee, which he poured himself from a thermos, and we sat in the chairs for 40 minutes, drinking coffee and not saying much, and at the end of the 40 minutes he said, in the English he deployed carefully, and specifically, when he wanted to be clearly understood, "You will take care of her." Not a question. I said yes. He said, "She does not need taking care of. You understand the difference." I said, "You will be present for her in the way she requires, and not in the way you decide she requires." He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded. One nod. The nod of a man who has received an answer that demonstrates the answerer understood the question. Her mother, Nane Lydia, was a different conversation entirely. Nane Lydia ran the sari-sari store that had been expanded from a window into a proper small shop over 20 years. And she had been watching the situation with the comprehensive attention of a woman who ran a business through the observation of what people actually did, rather than what they said they were doing. She had been watching me come to her house for 3 months before she spoke to me directly about anything beyond the social courtesies. When she spoke, she said, "My daughter is very clear about what she wants." I said, "Yes, she is." She said, "This is not always an easy thing in a wife." I said, "In my experience, the difficulty is an asset, if you understand what it is." She looked at me. The same look as Maravic, the same assessing directness. The look was hereditary. She said, "What is it?" I said, "It means she knows her own mind. A person who knows their own mind will never ask you to know it for them. That makes everything simpler." Nane Lydia looked at the store. At the inventory she had been managing for 20 years through the specific knowledge of what people actually needed rather than what they said they wanted. Then she looked back at me and said, "You are not a stupid man." I said, "Thank you." She said, "That is not a compliment. It is an observation. The stupid ones I send away immediately. The not stupid ones I watch longer." She picked up a cloth and wiped the counter. "I am still watching." She watched for another 3 months. At the end of those 3 months, she fed me without being asked when I came to the house, which Maravic told me was the indicator, the specific sign that Nane Lydia had reached a verdict, and the verdict was acceptance. The feeding was the declaration. Nothing needed to be said because the plate said it. I proposed to Maravik in December. On the boulevard at the time the sun goes down and does the thing it does there. The orange and then past orange and then violet in 20 minutes. Which is still, after 3 years of living there, the most beautiful 20 minutes of most of my days. I had a ring that I had bought from a jeweler in the city that Nane Lydia had recommended, which told me that the watching had concluded before the watching had been officially declared concluded. Maravik said yes, the way she said everything, directly, without performance, the word landing clean and whole, with nothing around it that wasn't the word. And then we went to the church. The church was important to Maravik. I want to say that clearly, because it is not incidental to the story, and because the version of this story that dismisses her faith as background detail is not the version that respects who she is. She had been raised in the Catholic Church in the specific way of a Filipino family for whom the church was not a Sunday obligation but a structural element, load-bearing, the thing the week was organized around rather than the thing appended to it. She believed, genuinely, from the inside, in the way that distinguishes belief from observance. She wanted to be married in the church, not because tradition demanded it, but because she wanted God in the room when she made the promise, and she did not think a civil ceremony had the same room. I am not Catholic. I want to say that, and what it means, which is that I went to the church for Maravik, rather than for myself. I went because what mattered to her mattered to me, and because the church mattered to her, and because love is not the management of your own preferences, but the genuine consideration of another person's, which I had learned late and imperfectly, and was trying to practice correctly.